Hi, Susana again here from Linocave Prints. We're on to the fun part of printmaking, printing. You all voted for a t-shirt for me to print, and I'm going to oblige. The block I made before is not great for t-shirts. It's better for tea towels or fabric, so I've picked this diamond-shaped block, which is a great block for t-shirts. I'm going to use an ombre color scheme, sort of moving from red to purple. Should be fun. And I'm going to show you what everybody wants to know is how to ink up your block properly so that you get really, really great prints. So I'm going to start by mixing my inks, and I'm going to start with like a silver blue color. And when you do an ombre, you start with very little ink because the first impression that we make, we're only going to make one impression, and then we're going to keep adding ink. If you start with a lot of ink, then to mix and to have different enough colors, you'll have this whole pile of ink, and at the end, it's all going to go, you know, it's going to be way more than you want left over. I try not to have too much left over. A tablespoon is, you know, the most I like to ever have left over. So I'm doing a bit of blue and a bit of silver. I'm going to mix them together with my palette knife. Until the ink is nice and integrated. And that's a pretty color. Next, I'm going to use my soft rubber brayer. Very, very key to use a soft rubber brayer. A hard rubber brayer is just going to cause this whole thing to end in tears. The other thing of note is that I do like to mark the backs of my blocks with this side up, and it helps with registration. I have to register this all by eye, so not rotating it just takes one more element out of misregistration, because I'm a human being after all, and this isn't exactly perfect. If I have a more complex design, sometimes I draw main elements of the design on the back of the block, so as I'm printing I can see. So what I'm going to do to ink up my block is to draw some ink down onto my piece of plexiglass. And I want to get sort of a happy, staticky sound and texture. I'm going to show it close to the camera that you can see sort of glittery texture of your ink. If you have too much ink, I'm going to put too much ink on purpose. You get this kind of streaky look. And that can be easily remedied by scraping your ink back into a pile at the top and redistributing it with your brayer until you hear a happy print sound once again. So in order to ink a block to print with fabric, we need to do a lot of thin layers of ink. Printing on fabric requires that you have a bit more ink on your block than if you were to print on paper. If you put as much ink on your block for paper as you do on fabric, it would shift around when you printed it on paper, but the fabric absorbs it and it doesn't move around much. So we need to be generous with our ink. So we'll start with one thin layer, gather a little bit of more ink. Make sure that you go in all directions. And cover each part of your block. Then you want to examine your block, and you want to make sure that you've really gotten good coverage, and you almost want a glittery texture to it. So if it looks like glitter on your block, you're ready to print. But you never make your first print on the thing you want to print on. I have a grubbity tea towel here that I use just for first impressions. It's kind of like the first pancake. It's no good. Same with your first impression. So you really are just discharging the ink onto the block and getting it prepared to ultimately print on whatever piece of fabric you do want it to appear nicely on. I like to use a hard rubber brayer to apply pressure. I feel like it almost mimics a printing press, but you can use a Baron or even a glass paperweight. You can use your hands. You can be creative. So as you can see, it printed, but just okay. The next print that I do on my t-shirt, I'll definitely want to be more saturated. But since I've discharged this onto a scrap piece of cloth, it should be fine and there shouldn't be any problem with my next impression. I'll show you those steps next. Great. Now it's time to print. Got my whole setup. I've got my favorite printmaking tool, a damp rag. This is really important to keep your fingers clean. Wipe pathologically, like the ink is coronavirus. So we're going to ink up our block and we're going to start to print. I'm using my silver blue color. We'll only use this for one impression, so there's not too much of it. Getting my nice inky sound. Multiple thin layers of ink. Making sure that I get full coverage. And I got ink somewhere that I don't want to print, so this handy dandy thing will get rid of that. I check to make sure that there's a glittery surface on my ink. And I'm sure somebody somewhere out there has some brilliant way of finding the middle of the t-shirt. I'm a wing it type of person, so I'm going to wing it. And I do take a bit of time to sort of hold my head above my block, make sure my block's oriented correctly, and be decisive in my impression. I apply pressure with my hard rubber brayer. And this is where Speedy Carve really comes into play. It's nice and soft. I'm getting nice, good contact here, and my padded table will make sure that I get nice, even and crisp prints as long as I've applied my ink correctly. So now I'll peel it off, and it's good. It's nice and dark. So I'm going to move on to my next color. So this is very specific to my ombre method. I like to not clean in between colors. I just like to not clean. I scrape all my ink back to the top, and I'm going to add a bunch of violet to it. And I'm going to need a little bit more of this color because I'm going to make 1, 2, 3, 4 impressions of this color. I don't add a ton though, because like I said before, I don't want a lot left over. I'm going to add just a little touch of magenta too to really make the colors be different. So I mix it all in. And as you can see, this color is definitely distinctly different. Then the silver blue. Got kind of a nice violet. And I don't clean my block in between colors. I just go right over the previous color, making sure I get lots of thin layers. And good coverage, especially on this first impression when I change from one color to another. I really want to make sure I get enough ink. Oops, I got a little bit of something in there. Okay. Check to make sure that it looks glittery. And I got a little bit of ink on my fingers, so I'm going to wipe them off. They really got to be clean. And then I'm going to come over and I'm going to carefully line up my blocks, making sure all my edges meet. I do take time with this step. A lot of you see me working on time lapse, and it looks like I do it really, really fast. That is not the case. These t-shirts take about an hour to print. So there we go. We've got a nice transition. And I'll do this again. And when you're making these ombres, you want to think about your color theory. You don't want to go from red to green. You don't want to go from one complementary color to another because you're going to get brown in the middle. I mean, unless you want that, unless that's what you're aiming for, which is why I sort of stuck to one side of the color wheel in this case. You can go the full rainbow. You just got to plan it out a little bit and be judicious with your ink. That's a little bit more difficult. But if you use a contiguous group of colors, it makes it a lot easier. Checking for sparkle. It's second nature for me at this point. Lining it up carefully. Pressing firmly. Sometimes I even hit it. And peel off. And I'll continue on.